My name is Mark Feasel. I work for Schneider Electric. I lead a couple things for Schneider Electric. One is our electric utility business, and another part of what I do is I lead what we call new energy landscape, and that includes things like microgrid, virtual power plant, demand response. Those things may seem dissimilar, but I think you'll see as the presentation goes on, there's a lot of convergence happening. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm an ex-Navy nuclear guy, so I rode around a submarine for a bunch of years, and I live in Ohio right now, and happy to be out here in warm Nevada. This presentation is it's non-commercial in nature. We're going to talk about microgrids, but when you talk about microgrids, you end up talking about a lot of things. You end up talking about how people think about energy, how they're consuming energy, what their relationship looks like with their utility, how technology is evolving around distributed energy resources and load management, and software and control systems. So it's a pretty wide field. Today's topic is a little more business-oriented in nature. So we're going to talk about business models and risks and what's happening in the market. I'm happy to kind of dig into some of the technology. We've got an hour, so I think we've got plenty of time. We also, it's I think a small group here today, so if you'd like to ask a question, I'll have some time at the end, but I think we can go ahead and have some in the middle too. So if there's something on your mind, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll try to get it done. And if we're slowing down too much, I'll hold them towards the end. But for now, feel free to ask them. Feel free to ask them as we're going. 4 fundamental things I think we want to get out of this is how do you go about making a financial case for a microgrid? We'll touch on some of those elements, and we won't be able to sit here. It's a complex process to do that. I know some of you are in the middle of that. So we're not going to be able to completely go through all the elements, but I think what we'll do is hit some of the high points, some of the considerations to think about that. Number 2 is to think about this idea of microgrid as a service or energy as a service, what that means, how it's changing the market, and how it's changing who is buying energy infrastructure, as well as some of the implications on that. Number 3, some of the commissioning process will hit upon what does it take to make these microgrids work, what are some of the considerations, how do we think about how a microgrid performs versus how it was designed. I'll hit on some of those topics. And then finally some of the technology, thinking about resilience and how people are thinking about resilience differently today than maybe we all thought about resilience 5-10 years ago. So those are the key things we want to get done. We'll start off with this idea of these megatrends, and I think these are pretty important. They're affecting everyone in the energy value chain, whether you make energy or whether you consume energy, whether you're in somehow in the middle of delivering energy. These things are affecting business models, and it's pretty evident from all the companies that are starting up and those that are going out of business. There's a lot of forces that make it pretty difficult and interesting right now in this space. So one good way to remember this in your head is 3D plus more E. So the 3 Ds being digitization. There will be 50 billion connected devices by 2020. Between now and 2020, there will be 10 times more devices connected than people connected in the world. So these devices are coming online. The devices, of course, digitization providing data. And as we're going to see, it's having a pretty profound effect upon how the grid can work, how people think about energy, and what they're doing to change their role in the energy value chain. The second thing is decarbonization. Decarbonization simply means that there's a lot of consumers that want to consume energy with a lower carbon footprint. In fact, 93% of all Fortune 500 CEOs have some kind of sustainability metric in their performance. Your companies may have them. My own company has a goal to be 100% on renewable energy by 2030. You may find your companies have similar things detailed in their annual reports. It's becoming very common, and it's changing the way people think about how they're buying energy and what they're doing about it. And the third thing is decentralization. This idea that we can put distributed generation anywhere on the grid, we can put distributed control much farther out in the system, and optimize locally. Those are the 3 Ds. And finally, more E, electrification. Now, when you think about electrification, you might think that's a global phenomenon. Heck, I mean, maybe load here in the U.S., some of you may be in the utility industry, you know that load in some parts of the country is flat. In fact, it might be falling. And in fact, energy as a function of GDP, and energy as a function of population is actually decreasing. But the electrical portion of that is increasing, or will increase over the next 10 years, primarily because of two factors here in the US. The first one, EV, right? So that's going to be a big implication. The second one is the electrification of ports, and a lot of electrification of infrastructure, whether it's people movers at airports or whether it's thinking about shore power in new ways. A lot of electrical distribution infrastructure going in to do those things. So here in the US, 3D plus more E. Globally, the more E would be about bringing the billion people that don't have access to energy today onto the grid. And by the way, there's still another 1.5 billion people that only have access to intermittent energy. These things are having a pretty profound effect on the way people think about energy. Let's dig into one other big thing that's going on. This is a cool graph that you can pull out of the Quadrennial Energy Report that was published about 3 years ago. If you've never downloaded or got it, it's free. You can get it from energy.gov. Well worth it. Just for the beautiful illustrations, for a couple PowerPoint wares, it's well worth your time to get it. But this thing I thought was really interesting, and I think it's something we all feel, that we seem to be having these storms. I mean, last year, whether it was Houston or Florida or Maria down in Puerto Rico, it just seems like, gosh, this has got to be, I don't remember this. You know, when I was younger, this impact of the storms on the grid and these outages. But interesting illustration of what is going on, and it's not just imagination. So, you know, this is billion-dollar disaster events per year for the U.S. from a time period from 1980 to 2014. So pretty profound change in these events. Now, partially it's because our infrastructure is getting older. That's true. But it's also because electricity plays a much bigger part in our society today. So when you have an outage, it takes down the data center that keeps you from buying something on Amazon. It didn't, maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it didn't keep you necessarily from going down to the local hardware store and giving a guy a $20 bill. So this connected economy is having a pretty profound effect on this. So what does all this mean? Data, that digitization thing, is demystifying energy. You think about, electricity is invisible, it travels at the speed of light, and it's dangerous, right? So it's probably no big surprise in the 1830s when Westinghouse and Edison and Tesla were putting together the business models and building the electric utility industry, that it was designed in such a way that just a small amount of people could control and interface with electricity. And the rest of us were very passive, right? We kind of got this electricity and we made the best of what we had, but we really weren't empowered to work with it. Those were just too high barriers to overcome. But data is changing that. With data, we have understanding into what is correlated to our energy spend. You can imagine a hotel like this. The primary process in this hotel is the building automation system, right? And its purpose is to keep people comfortable and safe. And I would imagine that the load in this building today is primarily driven by weather, right? Probably the temperature outside, degree days, and occupancy. Those might be two things. In the factory down the street, if there is one somewhere around here, it might be the number of widgets produced. You have less air-conditioned space. It might be a productivity thing. But data is what's more precisely allowing consumers to attribute their energy costs, whether it's consumption or a demand, to specific processes. It was just something that 20 years ago, only the most energy-intense customers could afford to invest in the technology to get it. I've been in the energy industry, 30 years now, and spent a lot of time putting systems in. To put an energy management system in 20 years ago, first of all, there was no digital devices on your grid. You had Atom. There was no meters. You had to add meters. You had to add communication gateways. You had to, and by the way, there was no such thing as Ethernet or wireless. So you had to spend all this money running wires and different protocols. You had all these protocol converters. I know some of us still live in that life today, so it still goes on even now, but it's less. The difference, though, is that when you buy a variable frequency drive or an inverter or an electrical distribution switchgear or I don't care, whatever, it's communicating today. The odds of it having some kind of telemetry and creating data, and probably creating data in a way that's open and interoperable, are very high. And what that does is significantly lower the barriers to creating situational awareness on the electrical distribution system. Completely lowers the cost. There's no way that 20 years ago you could afford to put a microgrid in a place like this. You can today. Data is one of the biggest reasons. Demystifying energy, it helps both the consumer and the utility understand much more, at a much more finite degree, what's going on right now. The implication of that is that the grid is becoming consumer-centric. And we're going to talk about a few examples of this, but people are becoming less interested in buying what is publicly available in the grid that may or may not meet their business objectives. They're much more interested in thinking about what does energy need to do to my process. Let's just think about this in a very simple way. NV Energy probably has a feeder that is running down through here, through town, and on that feeder is a hospital and an elementary school. Probably a pretty common occurrence that those two things might be together somewhere. And an outage occurs. The impact of the outage on the hospital, it's profound, right? People could die, doctors could get sued, bad situation. Impact of the outage on the elementary school, the kids go on recess and the teachers take a smoke break, right? So a very, very different outcomes for that same event. So you can imagine that if these consumers start having options to, in a more bespoke way, solve for their needs, that is right-sized, and we'll talk about what some of these factors are in a little bit, they'd probably be interested in doing so. So it's consumer-centric, load-centric, simply meaning that generation is going closer to the load. Why are all the generation stations 50 miles away from you? Because back when we created a centralized grid, we used big fossil fuel burning things to go do that, right? The very first grids were microgrids, but they, you had dust and soot and everything else created by them, and it wasn't very convenient. So we created a transmission distribution system to get that burning away from us and just have this beautiful clean electricity next to us. But increasingly, as we create energy with renewable sources like solar and fuel cells, wind, these things you can put much closer to the load, which impacts efficiency and impacts resilience, right? Less things to fail between. And finally, modular, flexible, scalable. Thinking with data, and we'll dig into this just a little more in a bit, but this idea that you would take a microgrid and apply it to a whole facility is no longer vogue, right? This ability with data, you can characterize your needs much better. So it's probably true that the coffee pot on the third floor of this building is less vital than, the emergency exit signs that are going to get us out of here. Right? And the same thing would be true and much more complex in a factory, right? Loads have all kind of different priorities. The ability to understand, is this a load that can never see an outage? Is this a load that can never see a power quality anomaly? Or could I go without it for, 2 minutes? Okay, that doesn't need to be behind the UPS, it could be on the backup generator. Or could I go without, for an hour? Maybe I could allow temperature to decrease for an hour or increase for an hour in this facility before it became unbearable. Maybe that can go on a load bank that would be brought in once more generation was available. So this idea to be able to take and apply microgrids in a very prescriptive, small way and create essentially a federation of microgrids to solve for a campus like this is a new concept that data and digitization are helping with. So what's going on? I mean, why doesn't everyone have a microgrid today if it can deliver you resilience, sustainability, and cost benefit and all these things? Well, the challenge is there's a lot of complexities associated with microgrids, and I know it's why a lot of you guys have great jobs because you help take that complexities away from our energy consumers. Think about codes and regulations. Can I apply this? Distributed generation? Am I allowed to run diesel in this facility for some period of time if it's not an emergency? You may or may not, depends on where you live. What about incentives and rebates? What would the state of Nevada give me for running combined heat and power or solar or a battery incentive? Those things are changing all the time. Rate tariffs changing all the time. So how economic viable is it for me to operate with decentralized generation versus the grid? Technology, battery prices dropped 75% in the last 5 years, and it's going to drop another 73% by 2025. solar energy prices drop by a factor of 3. If you're not keeping up on this technology evolutions in price, when's the right time to get in? I don't know. So there's a lot of complexity. Microgrids are difficult to engineer, right? They require power system engineering and mechanical engineering, civil engineering, all these things coming together to deliver a highly integrated system. That's a lot to take on unless you're in the business. So you've got a scenario in which many people are interested in it, and some people have taken the jump, especially, critical power infrastructure, U.S. military, governments. You've heard of these big microgrids coming online. But this curve I stole from Jeffrey Moore. I guess that's what you guys probably recognize, right? Crossing the Chasm. I hope you've read this book. It was actually came out in the 90s and explained how high-tech companies, essentially what you could do to get your offer successful in this world where 10 people are creating a web browser. And the concept being that there is a gap between the early market people, I know it's a little bit hard to read. The first one is the innovators and early adopters. There are people that will take those risks I just said because they're interested in and want to do it, or it's worth so much to them that they have to do it right now. But the early majority and the late majority will not take those risks. So that chasm exists. What does it take to cross the chasm, to go from these early market adopters to the main market? We're going to talk about today as a business model, energy as a service or microgrid as a service, where consortiums of companies and government agencies and others come together to remove those risks on behalf of the end user. And it is what's going to cause this market to flip from already a pretty fast-growing market to something that's really going to hit Main Street. So, if you've got a microgrid, if you're thinking about energy, historically you've had to solve for resilience separate from other concerns. So, if you're a hospital and you wanted resilience, you bought backup generators, or a data center, backup generators, right? Diesel generators. When they burn fuel to make energy, are they greener than your grid? Probably not, right? Is the energy that you would create from backup diesel less expensive than you can buy from the grid? Probably not. So when you made an investment in resilience, it was at the expense of sustainability and cost. So that's what this kind of represents, an integrated outcome. What's different and what we're talking about in the next 5 years is as you use more clean energy sources as we call it the anchor resource or the primary generation source of these microgrids. Let's talk about solar and battery. Let's talk about fuel cell. You end up with a scenario in which you can co-optimize all three of these things at once. An investment in resilience can also be an investment in sustainability and an investment in cost savings. You'll see that there's one primary concern: efficiency. Efficiency plays in all of these things. So when consumers begin to think about energy in new ways, they think about a co-optimized cost, resilience, and sustainability, but efficiency affecting all of those. As you become more efficient, you use less energy, you affect your costs. You also become more sustainable. But you also become more resilient. A lot of people don't think about this, but less load to pick up after an outage. It helps on resilience as well. So as you think about those three things, I just want to highlight a couple points that isn't always obvious. Energy cost. It's not, I guess the thing that's not obvious, at least to everyone, it's not always about the lowest cost. I know some of you may be in the performance contracting business, so you realize this, that it can be about a more predictable cost, right? If you're a municipality, and you're always working, you can't make more widgets to make up for a cost delta, and all of a sudden we had a really bad winter and you used a lot of energy. That cost delta, or you have a rate increase, that's hard to make up for, right? You've got to do things that are punitive to the citizens of your area in order to make up for that cost delta. So figuring out a way, if a microgrid or an energy system could deliver a more predictable cost, is a very good outcome, for a lot of folks. The sustainability, that's something that is increasingly popular. I think would say 5 years ago might be more of a greenwash scenario. Certainly something that consumers are asking for today. And then resilience. So not just thinking about, how does this affect my business, but how does it affect my employees? How does it affect my customers coming to my site, these things being the integrated outcome. So what are people doing different? So 3 big kind of cases on what's going on, and I'm going to dig deeply into one of them, Montgomery County. I'll start with the one that's right here. Do we have anybody from MGM in the room by chance? No? Okay. So you may have heard MGM paid $87 million to essentially exit the regulatory structure of the state of Nevada. So they no longer have to pay. So in a state that, you may know every single state has different rules around the regulation of utility. And in some states, you're required, they're called vertically integrated, you're required to buy from the utility. MGM paid an exit fee of $87 million. They felt that the energy, they gave a bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons was that their sustainability goals and objectives were moving faster than that of what's going on in the state of Nevada. They couldn't get to the sustainability goals that they wanted, and that their customers, the people that stay in their hotel and gamble in their casinos, was demanding, and still be connected to the grid here in Nevada. So they paid $87 million to exit that. And now the question is, so what do they do different? Which we're going to get into some of that in a little bit. Second one, Ohio State University. Ohio State University, one of the largest universities here in the U.S., over 50,000 students at that university. They essentially sold their central plant and energy distribution system and operations to a third party, Engie, right? So Engie is a large French utility. Engie paid them $1.6 billion for those assets. Now, it wasn't, I said the word sold, the truth is it's a more complex financial arrangement than that because they're a public institution, but for all intents and purposes, think of it that they sold it. So with that money, so imagine this scenario, Ohio State University essentially coming to the realization that what are we in the business to do? Are we in the business to understand the regulatory charter of the state of Ohio and understand if they're going to outlaw coal or not? Or do we want to make bets on battery technology and solar? Do I want to maintain a massive staff of people to go and manage this plant and optimize it for all the technology changes in 50 years? Or do I want to focus on educating students? They decided that they wanted to focus on students. And so they gave Engie the exclusive right to sell them energy for 50 years in exchange for this $1.6 billion payment. With that $1.6 billion payment, which was 25% of the endowment, they're hiring new teachers, they're hiring new scholarships, building new colleges, etc. This is going to be a pretty big trend. So this is a consumer thinking about that sustainability, cost, and resilience and saying, look, my role in this has got to change. And energy as a service is one way that we could achieve those. All 3 of these deals in some way have facets of energy as a service. If you're I won't go through the details now, but if you're interested in a fun corollary to all this, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a bunch of great books. I'm sure you've read them. He's got a podcast called Revisiting or History. Maybe you guys, was it Revisiting History? I think it's called. It's on, Revisionist History. And in the first season, which was 2 years ago now, there's an episode called Food Fight. And I don't know if anybody in the room heard that, but the very quick story of that is there's 2 colleges, right? There's Bowdoin College and there's Vassar, I think, right? One of them has awesome food and one of them has bad food. And in both cases, these are very affluent colleges where people pay God knows what to go there, right? And so the point was, what the heck, why is Vassar ripping off their students by not having Emerald as their cook, which is what Bowdoin had essentially? And the story comes down to is that there's a decision to be made for these universities, right? The story is there is one group of people that pay a large amount to go there, and there's a whole other group of people that can't pay anything to go there. And if you're a university, shouldn't your goal be to educate as many people as possible, right? And if anything you can do to make that one side a little bit larger, to make the barbell between the 2 ends a little bit thinner, doesn't that make sense for your mission? And so listen to that sometime if you get a chance. You'll think about a bunch of things, but it's what plays into the story. So I'm going to dig into Montgomery County, Maryland, just because it's very close to this job. Montgomery County, Maryland, large county right outside Washington, D.C., So if you've ever been to Silver Springs, Maryland, you've been there. Bunch of hotels. If you go to Washington, D.C., you probably stay or eat here because it's very close. It's a very affluent part of the country, so they're not lacking money. In fact, they're AAA credit rated, so access to money is not their problem. They've been impacted by some pretty severe weather events. So they've had several times over the last 3 years where they've had their entire traffic signal systems go down. They've lost the ability to dispatch fire and ambulance. So, I don't know if you guys remember derecho and some of these storms that happened. It hit them pretty hard. They also only had the ability to operate for 3 days without backup. Some other thing coming in. Their own backup facility can only operate for 3 days. So they didn't really know what their plan was after that, or the plan wasn't very pretty after that. So they're kind of thinking about these things. Gosh, I've got a resilience problem. They also have a goal to be more sustainable. The people that live in Montgomery County value sustainability. The businesses that grow there value sustainability, and that's been a big kind of a big part of their brand now for some time. And they think it's paying off. It's very like I said, it's very affluent, great jobs. Amazon is considering them for HQ2. So a lot of good things, and. But they decided that they wanted to figure out how to go solve this resilience. They wanted to get more sustainable, but also they didn't want to spend their own money to go do it. Why not? They've got this money, right? But if you're a city, and you've got a choice to buy a bunch of electrical things that go in a back room that nobody sees, or maybe to build a new park or a school or a bike path, you can imagine how that might be in their mind, a better investment, something that's much more visible for the community. So they wanted to see if they could figure out a way to do this without putting their own capital to work, okay? And so the story is that we, and when we were involved in this project, we had to figure out the technical solution. How do we go and address these facilities? So there was two campuses. One of them was the public safety headquarters. That's where police, fire, and ambulance are dispatched. And the second one is a correctional facility. So what kind of energy sources do you put in there? What is going to help their sustainability? But it can't be at a premium to what they're paying to the grid today. They also had another challenge. They had some failing infrastructure. They had a piece of electrical distribution switchgear in a major substation that was going to be a multi-million-dollar investment for them. They're like, hey, if you can figure out how to fix that at the same time, all the better, right? So the equation was get more sustainable, get more resilient, upgrade my old stuff, and I don't want to pay anything more than I'm paying today. Not necessarily the easiest challenge, but that was the engineering and kind of the financial equation that we were faced with the county. So I'm going to detail a little bit, but the story that was put together was this energy-as-a-service model. Energy-as-a-service is a mechanism that essentially creates a private utility for a specific load. It is owned by someone else, so it's off balance sheet, okay? So it is not necessarily like an energy savings performance contract where you are taking out debt and guaranteeing it with the energy savings. It's completely off balance sheet. So you're simply agreeing to a long-term contract to buy energy from this bespoke utility. So remember going back to the school and hospital, if they each could design their ideal grid, they probably would design it differently. That's essentially what energy-as-a-service does. It allows a consumer to prescribe the balance of resilience, sustainability, and cost that makes sense for them. The assets are held by an off-balance sheet entity that sells that entire circle of efficiency, resilience, sustainability, and cost back to the consumer. That's the story of what got put in here. So this project, the outcomes of it, it went from 3 days of backup power to 10 days. Energy costs, neutral. Energy costs, not only neutral to what they're at now, they're fixed for 15 years. So they have a guaranteed energy price for 15 years. So that's a pretty big thing in their mind because budget fluctuations were a problem. They reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, and it was important for them to kind of create a replicable model. So that's why there being a lot of city governments, people don't talk about what they've done. They've been very forward in speaking about this because they really think, and by the way, the leaders, Eric Kaufman, Michael Yambrock, These guys were instrumental in figuring out how to put this whole thing together. It really takes someone that's it's not easy to take risks in that kind of environment, and someone willing to think outside the box. So a lot of credit to those guys for really thinking through some of these details. Let's talk about then this. How do you go and get that resilience that they were looking at, and so how do you accomplish all those things? When you think about resilience, historically, how do you go attack that? Right? Redundancy, diversity, and efficiency. Those are the three kind of long-term things. What you go do. Some new approaches, though, these microgrids are unlocking that didn't exist in the past. And there's a couple of quotes up there. I know they're a little bit hard to see, so I will kind of repeat them to you. The first approach is digitization. So that was an integral part of Montgomery County. Whatever goes in is going to be connected, and it's going to be sensitive to energy price and resilience given the current configuration of the grid. So this is a quote from a senior director at Salesforce.com. Internet of Things unlocks better performance from existing assets. Smart's not parts. Software is the key. Don't really need two of everything to ensure resilience. That's, data center guy, that's kind of surprising here, right? I know some of you guys work in data centers, not just two of everything, five of everything, but he's saying software, software, software. And he's right. It's something we're definitely seeing. It's what's allowing and unlocking some of this resilience. The second quote is a guy named Peter Asmus from Navigant. He's probably, I don't know if you guys know Navigant, I would say he's probably one of the best analysts or thought leaders on the microgrid energy-as-a-service space. He did a study of data centers. He said a fully redundant two-end power architecture could more than double the 10-year TCO of a non-redundant one-end power architecture. Probably not surprising. What surprised me was the second part. Although a significant cost penalty was all the stuff in the beginning, all the electrical and mechanical stuff, the greater influence comes from the energy cost associated with operating and maintaining the stuff that essentially you're not using except for an emergency. So this idea that there is a pretty incredible heavy tax to be paid over the TCO, total cost of ownership, of a facility by investing in redundancy. And if software can take out some of those costs, that's one of the real key things to making these things work. There's not many consumers that are going to allow you to put all these things in and take a big cost premium to where they're at today. If you can figure out how to go do it and deliver neutral or even less in some cases, you can get some of these projects, you can get some of these things to happen. Software, a real key piece of that. So how did the specific business model, let's go back to Montgomery County. In this case, there was an investor owner, Duke Energy. So Duke Energy operates large regulated utilities in the state of North Carolina, South Carolina, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. But they also have a non-regulated group that can operate anywhere. Okay, so they're more just like an energy services company in that fashion. They are interested in owning assets on behalf of others. You might ask why. Why would Duke Energy want to do something like this? Well, let's think about their regulated business. Right? Their regulated business essentially gets permission from a public utility commission to invest in infrastructure and gets a guaranteed return off that infrastructure over some period of time. That's the business model of electric utility and the rate-based model. Right? So the challenge is that energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation, and storage are undermining their business model. They're not making money as fast as they were. And so they've got a problem. In fact, Duke Energy has for 4 years in a row now borrowed money to pay their dividend to their shareholders. If you guys know anything about electric utility shareholders, the people that invest in electric utilities are only about one step more risky than the bond market. They didn't buy Tesla stock for a reason. They bought Duke stock, and they expect a guaranteed return and they expect a dividend every year. There is no option to say, sorry, shareholders, I just can't pay a dividend this year because I got a cash flow problem. I got to wait for the next rate case. No, they had to borrow to go do it. So utilities are facing this conundrum right now. How do I do this? So Duke had what's called literally a revenue replacement strategy. Every major electric utility in North America right now has the same kind of plan, whether they call it that or not. In the case of Duke, the story is that, look, right now I buy those assets and I get a guaranteed rate of return through the rate base. But it's just not happening anymore because of those things I just mentioned. So what if I could own assets buy and own assets. Now, maybe it wouldn't be a guaranteed rate of return, but I would buy and own and operate the same kind of assets. Would that story be palatable to my shareholders? And the answer was yes. So in this case, Montgomery County, I mentioned they're a AAA credit company. They signed a 20-year agreement with Duke Energy to buy energy. Duke Energy owns all those assets. Montgomery County owns none of them, right? If they don't operate, Montgomery County doesn't care. They're not paying for it. We're going to talk about the cement. All of the risks, everything is taken off of Montgomery County. They're not worried about, did they pick the right kind of generator? Did they pick kind of the right kind of solar panels? How does all this work? Someone else owns it. They simply have to buy the offtake of those. In this case, Duke owned the assets. A microgrid integrator, which in this case was Schneider Electric, designed, implemented the microgrid along with providers of combined heat and power. So both of those two sites, we added CHP systems and solar. The end result for Montgomery County, no upfront capital, infrastructure improvement, so that piece of multi-million-dollar piece of switchgear got replaced, more predictable energy cost, high reliability, and better sustainability. So that's actually my final slide, and what the story I think that if there's one takeaway here, that energy as a service is a story of risk, right? It's not just about financing assets, and I think, if some of you are in the ESPC space, this is kind of the difference. There's risk in the ESPC space, but it generally is around more passive things. When you begin to implement microgrids and distributed energy resources, there are many risks, and I detailed 7 of them. Someone has to go and explain to the consumer what the opportunity is. So that's a development cost essentially. Someone's got to design a microgrid, make sure it works. Someone has to construct it. Someone's got to warranty all the parts. Someone has to take credit risk. What if Montgomery County goes out of business or decides to move their town? Unlikely, right? And regulatory risk. What if somebody says, sorry, you can't use gas in the state of Maryland tomorrow? Somebody's taking that risk. And finally, performance risk. Is this stuff going to work? A lot of the microgrids that have went in so far leave consumers with some of these risks. Like, hey, you tell me what you want and I'll build it. Oh, I want a Caterpillar this and a whatever. Okay, but that risk is then left on the person that chose it, right? Or what if the solar panel that, or the battery company that you want to invest in went out of business and you can no longer get spare parts? The story of energy as a service is bringing together a coalition of people that take all of those risks on behalf of the consumer. I mean, think about if we were going to build a new wing on this building today. Would you call up the utility and say, hey, where are you going to site that generator? And how are you going to run your poles to get here? And are you using copper or aluminum wire? You wouldn't ask any of those questions, right? You just get a service entrance. The utility is taking all those risks. People live in a world in which utility has assumed all of these risks for them in the past. If we expect to go put a new business model in place in which people are putting distributed generation on their own sites, and you're expecting them to start taking some of these risks, it's going to be an impediment to the market. So that goes back to that curve with Jeffrey Moore crossing the chasm. To cross the chasm, you've got to take these risks. So there's 4 major types of companies. I actually show a 5th one, an IPP, that are developing right now. Development companies that are engaging in conversations with consumers. EPCs that are designing, building, and bringing these components in. Asset companies. These are the companies that are owning assets on behalf of others. In the past, the electric grid was owned by regulated electric utilities. In the future, it will not be. You saw Ohio State, NG owns those assets. MGM casinos, well, whoever they go into agreements with will own those assets. Increasingly, private capital, private equity companies like Carlyle Group, Blackstone, JP Morgan Chase, et cetera, are coming in and directly owning these assets. Essentially, it's creating utility 2.0, load-specific, customer-specific. And then finally, operations companies that take on performance risk. So they're performing preventative maintenance, they're making sure the asset's running, and they're tracking it against what the design constraints are when we do it. The final group I'll mention is kind of a new and emerging group, microgrid independent power producers. And these are folks that are coming in. They're serving the role of both the OpCo and the AssetCo, owning those assets on behalf of the end user. So these new companies are springing up. You'll read news almost every day of different kind of companies getting each of these spaces. They're probably playing one of these roles. They're probably designed to take on some or all of these risks. In my experience, it's a coalition of companies that best do this. These are different kind of risks. My company is very capable of taking on some kind of risk, but I'm not a bank, right? I'll just be real specific with my company. I'm a technical company. I don't mind technical risk, warranty risk, engineering risk. We do that for a living. Am I a bank? Nope. Am I an expert on the regulatory structure of the state of Nevada? Nope. I would rather not take that risk. And I don't really operate assets. So I kind of chart how I fit in this piece. And then you've got to find the right other kind of partner. So I think the message, whether you are a facility manager and you're seeing some of these assets come in, or maybe a vendor or an energy service provider in this space, this is the opportunity. These are the things that need to be done to go serve this market. How can we put the right coalitions together to solve this problem, to cross the chasm, to allow this cleaner, more sustainable, and potentially lower cost energy to consumers? And with that, I'm done, and I'll open it up to any questions. Yes, sir.
When does a microgrid type power producer get large enough that they're a macrogrid power producer and they start to compete with whoever's supplying electricity to those?
That's exactly what they're building. These companies that are doing this right now, they envision. I mean, I use a word. Right now, creditworthy, stable load is oceanfront property, right? There's only so much of it out there. There's plenty of nasty loads that move up and down, and it's hard to make all this stuff balance right. And there's plenty of people that don't pay their bills and all these, and those are valid concerns. And believe me, I don't say it with any triviality. We believe that energy is a basic human right, and we can't exclude those people. But there is a race for that oceanfront property right now. Who is going to go lock down the Ohio states? When you start doing that, to your point, that's 60 megawatts, right? Airports. And right now, JFK Airport, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and LAX are all going to do this. Every single one of those has some kind of solicitations or RFIs out on the street right now to do something like this. Those loads, these microgrid IPPs are going after. Their vision is to build essentially utility 2.0, and it absolutely will be in conflict with utility 1.0. Now, sometimes the utility 1.0, like Duke today, is also building utility 2.0, right? And so that's, I think, a strategy that you'll see. So you've seen, Edison International launch a business to do some of this stuff. Duke has, Constellation Energy has, it's Exelon, of course. So you're seeing, these historic utilities looking what these new business models and how they build it from the load out. So it will be competitive, but in some cases, it's an adjacent to their strategy. Yes, sir.
So for your Montgomery County example, Duke Energy is
Yes.
From the specifics of design through construction. So for design through construction, who really was in charge? Was it Duke Energy that basically made the final calls, made things happen, or how involved was Montgomery County?
Yeah, so in the specific case of Montgomery County, it actually was Schneider Electric that designed, built, implemented that microgrid. Now that is, it's not necessarily common. That was actually the first energy-as-a-service deal that I'm aware of that ever got written anywhere. And so all of us took on maybe a little more roles than we really wanted to take on. I'm not an EPC. We did it on that job because we had to really wrap those things. On a lot of jobs you're seeing now, you'll see major EPCs playing that part. So I'll just mention a few names. I'm not advocating any of them. They're all great. But Black & Veatch, AECom, SSOE, Burns & Mac, all these people are engaged on projects around North America, doing a lot of that engineering, design engineering. And it begins, one of the hardest parts, what's different about this is there's this interesting commingling of finance and engineering, right? Because the incentives and rebates vary quickly. There might be a program open up, and this is an exact case on Montgomery County. There was a CHP incentive that was out there. If we didn't have, this thing designed, in order to get that CHP, we had to go get efficiency first. That was a mandate. So our solution had to go get efficiency to allow us to qualify for the CHP incentive. But we had to have it designed by a certain point in interconnect agreement. Otherwise, it fell off the table and the project didn't pencil right.
So it's this interesting commingling of finance and engineering. Another example I'll give you guys is, and some of you guys may know this, the investment tax credit and production tax credits on solar. They apply to solar elements, but they also apply, so there's a 30% tax benefit on solar, this ITC, right? They apply to the solar panel, but they also apply to anything that is in which it's powered by more than 50% solar. So if you take a battery and you design the system in such a way that the solar energy is charging the battery, not the grid, you can count the battery towards the ITC. So you actually physically change the design to solve for a regulatory constraint. So that's an interesting angle in these projects that make it a little more complex. So it's not quite as solidified as the typical design build market is because of that nuances.
Just one more in that same
Yeah.
project, just that did it have a commissioning authority, and who actually did that person report to?
I don't think necessarily commissioning authority. I will say that because remember in this case Duke owned the assets, so Duke retained an owner's engineer, which in this case I believe was, well actually no, they did it themselves. They had their own engineering group. Sometimes these guys are retaining an owner's engineer, but in this case they had another advisory team coming in and do it that basically validated the design of Schneider Electric and promulgated the commissioning procedures and the sign-offs in which they were going to go own the assets. Other projects we work on, absolutely there is a role for a commissioning agent, others that will come in and kind of be a neutral third party on some of those. Once again, because this deal was it was kind of revolutionary at the time, we had to combine a lot of roles we wouldn't normally do. All right, yes sir. Long time. It didn't, like I said, the deal basically stopped. I mean, what happened was they said, here's what we want to do. And, well, first they said, hey, we want to go and somebody build us some microgrids. Of course, we raised our hand, sure, we'll help you. And, 17 people bid, and that whole process took, 6-8 months. And great news, Schneider got selected. All right. Oh, well, we have no money to pay you. Like, okay, great. You want to take a loan out? We can, some bankers. No. We don't want anything on our balance sheet. No, that's not a good thing. All right. Well, you can either move on or we can find something else. And it's really, like I said, it's really instrumental, the work that Montgomery County did, thinking through this, being open to essentially what becomes a public-private partnership at that point to go deliver these things. The whole project, though, gosh, almost 3 years by the time from first engineering look at it to finally getting something closed. Seemed like forever. Yes, sir.
There's a microgrid going on Schneider Black Beach.
Miramar.
Marine Corps Air Station, Miramar.
Yes, sir.
And from that project, I think that was kind of one of the first coming out of the Navy Marine group. And I don't know if that's going to be kind of the standard for most of the bases moving forward. Do you know about the landscape of that type of standard?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's the U.S. military has combined what was their office in sustainability to now it's sustainability and resilience. So they've actually combined those two words. And whenever you put sustainability and resilience together, you're really talking about a microgrid. So I think in premise that yes, this idea that you are going to have a decentralized grid that probably not ever disconnected from the main grid intentionally, but certainly disconnectable, is going to become more of a standard. And partially because you can do it in many cases without any cost premium. And so it becomes a bit of a no-brainer. I don't think that there is a specific this is the design we're going to use or anything like that. I think that's much more open, to the specific constraints of the base or whatever. There is a phase 2 going on. It just got announced. So the California Energy Commission just announced that they funded it. So that'll be a phase 2 on Miramar that's going to be come out later on this year. So it's going to keep on growing. And by the way, the ribbon cutting on that I think is in the September timeframe. On the Miramar. There's parts of it already up, but the final is that point. Yes, ma'am?
So when you say they own the asset, you're saying the building and everything in it,
So they own the electrical distribution assets. If sometimes, those are, and it wasn't the case in Montgomery County, but there are times, like on the Ohio State deal, where those are going to be big enough assets that you would actually have a building around it, and yes, they would become tenants. So on the Ohio State deal with Engie, and on other deals I've seen, Ohio State employees actually transferred to Engie that were operating and maintaining those assets as part of it. So you're seeing sometimes people go with some of these deals to go do that. And sometimes there are cases in which you literally are leasing space. That's part of what the revenue stream looks like. So either you're leasing it from the customer and you're paying for that asset sitting on their property, or you own a building and they're leasing space back in yours. So it can go either way. But yes, that's part of it. Yes, sir.
Is there a certain sweet spot in terms of size and scale of system?
Yeah, it's a great question.
And then as a kind of a secondary question to that, is anybody playing in the arena of smaller scale systems, say an industrial park or a small, public utility, something like that?
Yeah, the bottom end of a energy as a service play is probably in the maybe 2 to 3 megawatt range. That'd be the bottom end. And simply being, it's because the contractual and financial nature of these deals to put them together are heavy enough that you just can't expend that much energy for something like that. So most of the deals you're going to find are 3 megawatts and up. And they're very viable in that 5. Like a lot of industrial sites are in that 5 to 10 megawatt range. That's kind of a sweet spot. I'm seeing a lot of them come in. And then you have the other extreme. You have these university campuses. I mean, universities move in packs, right? So we were up at University of Michigan. There was a big consortium. That Ohio State deal is going to be the bellwether. University of Michigan, Dartmouth. There's like 10 of them right now that are looking at doing the same thing. Yes, sir.
Specifically to that, I know that I live in Florida, and driving to the beach, I saw there's a community that is actually 100%
Yeah.
powered by solar
Yep.
community. So it seems like even residential communities are going to this microgrid.
Yeah, there's some interesting things there. There's some, especially on new developments, there's some opportunity. Regulatory charter in, I think, all states, or at least the ones I'm aware of, prevent you from selling power to your neighbor unless you're going to do like MGM and pay $87 million to break the regulatory charter. And so you guys might read a lot about blockchain. Oh my gosh, if we use blockchain, you can have your pool pump and your guy's solar pump and that guy's Tesla battery, and it's all going to work together, and you're all going to split the savings, and you're going to settle it over blockchain. That's a great idea, but none of you are allowed to trade energy with each other right now because of the regulatory constraints. So I think new developments, you're seeing it, some of it, but in terms of everything else that's out there, in most states, in fact in all states right now, it's a big hurdle to actually get there today for connecting existing assets. We got time for, I think, 5 minutes left? Probably one more question if anybody's got a question. Yes, sir.
I'm a little confused about the MGM paying all this money to unplug.
Yep.
Is that normal? Does everybody have to do that? Or what, can you just briefly outline that?
Yeah, so in some states, the market is such that you can buy energy. So there's 4 parts of a utility, right? Generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. T&D are almost exclusively regulated in all states. Generation and retail are non-regulated. Sometimes both of them, sometimes one of them. It just depends where you live, right? And based upon that arrangement, you've got to pay certain players in the value chain. So in the state of Nevada, MGM had to, because of the regulatory construct, buy their energy from NV Energy, right? And the reason that they would ask to have to pay a disconnect fee is that state officials, the Public Utility Commission, made decisions to allow NV Energy to invest in assets to serve all of that load. MGM is 4% of the load of the state, 4%, right? It's very significant. And so the regulator said, hang on a second, we made decisions to allow a utility to buy infrastructure based upon certain loads. When you go leave the grid, that sticks everybody else with that thing, and that we made that decision without you. And MGM might say, well, I don't care. Why'd you make that decision? I think that was a bad decision. You never asked me about it, which might be a fair comment, right? But they say, I don't care, we're the boss, and if you want to leave, you're going to pay. So it's an interesting balance where you can leave, but you're going to have to pay this leaving tax. That's the way that Nevada is solving it. Other states, it's all different. The regulatory charter of every state is different. So in some states, you kind of, quote unquote, can't disconnect. In most states, you can create your own energy and consume it locally. But in the case of like MGM, you don't have enough space to create all of your energy locally. You're going to have to buy it. So what they really wanted to do was plant, I don't want to speak for MGM, you can go ask them yourselves, but one of the things that I know they've done is they wanted to go and build massive solar arrays here in Nice Lane, Nevada, and wheel the power. So they just announced a deal a couple months ago, I saw, that a massive solar, and by the way, the energy cost is much less than they're paying for NV Energy. So now they're looking pretty smart for paying that big $87 million deal. Did I answer that enough? Or okay. All right, well, I'd like to thank you guys for coming here this morning, and I appreciate it. Take care.